I would like to start by thanking and crediting the work of Jonathan Tavares and Javier Garcia Cano, whose knowledge and research on this topic have been essential in creating this video. Another big thanks goes to Emmanuel Saveedra, with his help and great expertise, as well as Eric Guevara and Barry's photography, with all the reenactors, for their incredible photos. The helmet type, known as a Morion, has become an iconic symbol of the Renaissance soldier. It is defined in its classic combed form by a distinct symmetry and balance between a crescent-shaped comb rising from a rounded bowl and a swept brim drawn up to points at the front and back. For many, it evokes the swashbuckling Spanish conquistador, an image reinforced by Hollywood films such as The Captain from Castile from 1947. As a light and serviceable headpiece, the Morion was so successful that it can be considered the first international helmet form, adopted by 16th century men-at-arms, merchants and colonists from Sweden to Italy and from Portugal to eastern Austria. Morions are found as far east as Japan, introduced by Portuguese merchants along with firearms in the 16th century. The Morion's popularity even bridged society's class structures. They were produced in varying quality and decoration for the lowest infantryman to the King of France, and was in use well into the 1600s. But the fact is that the popular and well-accepted image of conquistadores equipped with the iconic Morion helmet is wrong. This video will explain why, and touch upon 4 main points. 1. The origin of this misconception. 2. What equipment they actually used. 3. Contemporary sources and depictions. And 4. Who the people and individuals were behind the conquistadores. Important to understand is that the era of exploration happened in a relatively short pocket of time. The events involving the infamous explorers and conquistadores, such as Christopher Columbus, Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Ferdinand Magellan, Hernando de Soto, and others, all took place within a few decades in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Approximately 50 years, more or less. Another thing to keep in mind is that this was a transitional period in regards to clothes and armor. Europeans, and in this case Spanish soldiers, were still very much medieval-looking in their appearance, which would be appropriate for the time period in question. The Spaniards would therefore have looked more like the soldiers fighting in the Wars of the Roses or the Burgundian Wars of the late 1400s. Yet people tend to associate the conquistadores with clothing, fashion and equipment that in reality belonged to the later half of the 1500s and early 1600s, similar to the Battle of Lepanto or the Spanish Armada campaign. So how did this misconception become so widespread? The origin of this inaccuracy mainly stems from English and Dutch engravings and etched prints from the 16th and 17th centuries. Several European artists in the second half of the 1500s wanted to illustrate the arrival of the Spaniards in America and the subsequent conquest, in most cases to expand the black legend of the mistreatment of the natives by evil Spanish Catholics. The English and Dutch Protestants were bitter enemies of Spain during this period, hence the desire to try to smear and undermine the Catholics by all possible means. However, these artists did not have information about what, for example, the soldiers of Cortés or Pizarro looked like when they made their expeditions many decades before. What they did then was to represent the Spaniards as they knew them, that is, how the Spaniards of the 70s and 80s dressed and armed themselves. And it seems that the Morion helmet was very fashionable among the military at that time, and not only in Spain, since it could be found in almost any army in Western Europe. Thus, the wide dissemination of these engravings about the conquest, forever and incorrectly, linked the image of the conquistadores with the iconic helmet. Classic paintings from later periods has also continued this misrepresentation. Art movements such as Romanticism has skewed the image of the past even more. with fantastical and made-up clothing and equipment, blending different time periods. Add to this the misleading appearance of Spaniards dressed in cheap leather clothing or incorrect costumes in modern TV series and Hollywood movies. This has also spread to modern artwork, video games, and tabletop miniatures. Even historical book publishers such as Osprey have been guilty of this unawareness in some cases. All these factors have been contributing to an inaccurate depiction of the past and confusion among the general audience. When it comes to contemporary depictions of the famous helmet, the earliest reference and date we have is from a German engraving from 1555 by Hans Glaser. It depicts a group of soldiers, a Spaniard, a Swiss, and a German mercenary, with a boy wearing a combed morion. The date is certain because the year can be seen at the upper right corner of the illustration. Though we have to take into account that the first early variations of this type of helmet could have been made a little earlier, in the middle of the 1500s, most likely in Germany or Italy. Some examples have survived in museums and have been dated to around 1540 and 1550. However, the fully developed combe morion and its popularity among Spanish soldiers is difficult to find before the 1570s. At least, that is what we can deduce from the illustrations that have reached us. Therefore, we can ascertain that the Morion helmet was not in use by the conquistadores, at least not in the early campaigns, with the likes of Cortés, Pizarro, Orellana, Núñez de Balboa, and Pánfilo de Narváez, etc. So then the question becomes, what type of helmets and armor did they actually wear? Firstly, we must take into account that many of the conquistadors arrived in America from the first voyages of Columbus and stayed there in the Caribbean islands for many years, until they joined the expeditions that went to the mainland, Mexico, Florida, Central America, Colombia, and Peru. So the equipment with which they left Spain would be closer to the last years of the Granada War than to the latest trends in Europe. Secondly, some antique armor pieces from the 1400s would still be useful and ultimately serve for a long period of time and be passed down through generations. Thus, mixing of older and newer equipment would have been a likely phenomenon. For example, the military equipment used during the conquest of Mexico in 1519 came from the Italian Wars between 1494 and 1504. For that reason, some armor pieces could have been outdated and up to 20 years old. Most of the Spanish soldiers were already veterans of those wars. They had lived in Cuba and Hispaniola since 1508, 10 years before the beginning process of the Mexico expedition. These Spaniards had been isolated from the process of European modernization until the arrival of Julián de Aldrete in 1521, one of the treasurers of Charles V. So, with this information in mind, we can conclude that the conquistadors used different variations of sallets and kettle helmets, simple skull caps, and various styles of proto-burgonets. These early versions were basically open-faced sallets with attached brims. However, the most common helmet was the cabossé, with its distinct shape and stalk-like projection on top. Developed from the kettle helmet, the cabossé became the forerunner to the morion. This helmet evolved throughout the century and would eventually branch out into various styles. It was used long into the 1600s, ultimately ending in the shape of a pikeman's pot, back to its kettle helmet form. Soldiers of this time are often portrayed using a sort of neck and face protection called a beva. This is a piece that frequently appears in Spanish museums that hold complete equipment from that era. We also know that Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier of Cortés' army, mentions it in his diaries, stating that it was a highly sought-after item and that the members of the expedition would have given much to obtain one. Face protection must have been crucial when confronting a hailstorm of arrows, darts, and stones. Bernal Díaz's first-hand accounts of the conquest of Mexico are important, intriguing, and drops the reader right into the action, next to the ordinary soldiers and the bloody events that unfolded. Due to the climate and strategic necessity, many Spanish units opted to use escaupil, quilted cotton armor consisting of 24 rigid layers, similar to the European gambeson. This body protection was commonly used by the Aztecs and the Tlaxcalans. The Spanish in America were eccentric in the eyes of other contemporary Europeans. The blend of using outdated European military gear, often with North African influences, and adopting Native American armor, sandals, and other equipment made for an odd look. Spaniards could even be seen wearing feather crowns on their heads in some cases, and pantlis, banners tied on the back, just like the indigenous people. The Spanish also taught their native allies, the Tlaxcalans, to fight like Europeans with swords, shields, and copper-tipped pikes. By 1521, during the siege of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were already using crossbows on their walls. Regarding contemporary artwork and depictions, we have got three primary sources from this time. The first example are the reliefs that represent the War of Granada, which adorn the choir stalls of the Cathedral of Toledo. They were carved by Rodrigo Alemán between 1489 and 1495, and they tell the story of the reconquest of Granada against the Moors. Javier Garcia Cano created a number of sketches based on these sources in 1992. Here we can see very well different helmets and armor, such as sallets with and without visors, kettle helmets and cabasets, gear that we know certainly were produced in Spain, specifically in the village of Castejón de las Armas, in the province of Zaragoza. A later and much closer source is the murals of the Mozarabic chapel of the Toledo's cathedral that depict the conquest of Oran by the troops of the Cardinal Cisneros. The event took place in 1509, but the frescoes were painted in 1514 by Juan of Burgundy. It is the best source we have, since it is contemporary with the conquest of America. In these paintings we can find open sallets, this time without visors, and some kettle helmets and cabasets, particularly worn by a group of jinetes, Spanish light cavalry. Again, the figures presented by Javier are based on the previous mentioned painted ceiling of the Mozarabic chapel. Here we get a close look at the varying helmets and clothes of pikemen, rodilleros, crossbowmen, and handgunners in the early 1500s. Some are wearing breast and back plates, but other figures show the back uncovered. A few of the figures are wearing arm protection only for the elbow and shoulder. These additional illustrations were made by Antonio L. Martin Gomez between 1999 and 2000. They are also based on the same source. Clothing colors are mainly red and white striped hose, dark and light blue, pink and orange. Another noteworthy object that many soldiers carry are the round shields of great size, painted with a red cross on them. In general, the figures show that the survival of medieval features in the first decades of the 1500s were still very much prevalent. For example, there can be seen a plumed kettle helmet and an open helmet with a bever, as well as mail skirts and armor protection for the legs. The last figure is a jinete, wearing a brigandine in dark red color. He is holding what is known as an adaga shield of North African origin. Moorish light horsemen used it along with the lance with great proficiency, something that was eventually adopted by the Spaniards and Portuguese during the Reconquista. The last great source are the tapestries and paintings depicting the conquest of Tunis by Emperor Charles V, created by Jan Cornelis Vermeyen. This source is of importance because it is based on sketches from life made by the artist himself, who accompanied the expedition in 1535. Here we can see yet again different variations of sallets, cabasets, and proto-burgonettes, some with cheek pieces attached. So these types of helmets and equipment could could have been worn by the last conquerors who arrived directly from the homeland between the 20s and the 30s, with the latest European styles regarding armor pieces and clothing fashion. But who were these people, the individuals behind the term conquistador who set off for the New World? Most of them came from the regions of Extremadura, Castile and Andalusia. These lands proved fertile breeding grounds for the sort of desperate men needed in the conquest. There was a long history of conflict and much poverty there that ambitious men sought to escape. However, people from all over Europe joined the expeditions. It was not unheard of to have some Portuguese, Italian, Greek, French or German members. The conquistadores were often younger sons of minor nobility who would not inherit their family estates and thus had to make a name for themselves on their own. Many such men turned to the military because there was a constant need for soldiers and captains in Spain's many wars, and advancement could be fast and rewards, in some cases, could be rich. The wealthier among them could afford the tools of the trade, fine Toledo steel swords, armor and horses. Some individuals were simple thugs and criminals. Others were opportunists and adventurers. There were, of course, a great many that had years of experience from serving in the Italian wars as well. But as in any period throughout history, most so-called soldiers were just ordinary people, usually from poor conditions. Many of them could not even afford to buy armor of any kind. They were artisans and laborers, such as bakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, masons, and so on. These people sought a better life, far away from Europe, and they were prepared to take the risks involved in sailing across the sea to the New World, in the pursuit for wealth and honor. Another fact that is not often mentioned is that a lot of Africans were a part of the expeditions, either as slaves or free men. Some even joined as soldiers. From 1492 to 1517, Spain was involved in several struggles. The end of the War of Granada, campaigns in North Africa, a permanent state of war with France on the Pyrenean frontier, the Italian Wars, minor struggles with natives in the New World, and Muslim revolts in the south and east of Spain. From all these conflicts emerged the nucleus of Spain's first standing army, the Tercio, which would rule the European battlefields in the coming century. 800 years of war against the Moors of North Africa had formed a tough and warlike culture on the Iberian Peninsula, a people excelling in the art of warfare and hand-to-hand combat. During this period, the European battlefields had seen the emergence of pike weapons in most armies, and also the creation of the first formed units of handgunners that had previously fought in loose formations. Thus, the infantry had slowly become the rulers of the battlefields, replacing the cavalry. The adoption of the pike by Spanish soldiers and its exact date is not known, but perhaps the first contact with this weapon was made through the Swiss mercenaries that fought in the War of Granada. It does seem that the soldiers who embarked for Italy in 1495 carried pikes because the Ordinanza de Tarazona compelled each man, rich or poor, to possess a long spear. Another royal order issued 2 years later for the army of Roussillon ordered the division of the army into 3 parts, one armed with spears, like these that the Germans carried, called pikes. The pikemen were to be the core of the future army, and so the Tercio was formed. The infantry was divided into 3 parts, one of pikemen, one of crossbowmen or handgunners, and one of rodilleros. These rodilleros were sword and buckler men, armed with a rodella, a rounded shield. In the pictorial sources, many different sorts of shields are recorded, great and small, rectangular, oval or round, but most common is, by far, the heart-shaped adaga. Some examples are embellished with cords and tassels, rivets or a central boss, and others are painted in a natural buff color. Although the combination of pikemen and rodilleros did not survive long, it being soon perceived that the future belonged to the pike and shot combination. However, they did not disappear entirely from the Spanish army until the last years of the 1500s and into the 1600s, as soldiers armed with shields were specially useful in hand-to-hand combat, particularly in sieges and boarding actions. Yet, in the Americas, the sword and buckler men made up the majority of the armies. Shields still played a pivotal role against native missiles, unlike in Europe, where it had been in decline. In regard to the crossbow, it had been a very important weapon during all the Middle Ages in Spain, where there are only scarce references to ordinary bow-armed units. During the first years of the Renaissance, it had still a vital role to play. Crossbowmen received higher pay than other troops. In the Royal Order of Tarazona from 1503, it is established that each crossbowman must carry a cuirass, a helmet, a sword, a dagger and a quiver with 24 sharp bolts, and a strong crossbow with pulleys of 4 wheels. Until their disappearance from the Spanish armies, crossbowmen evolved from foot to mounted troops, as in other European armies. After some years of campaigning in Italy, their place in both their mounted and foot roles was taken over by arquebusiers. But the crossbow had a longer life in the New World than in Europe. The reason for this is mainly because it was easier to handle in a very wet climate and where it was difficult to get powder. Also because its traditional use had not been forgotten in the southern parts of Spain. The same can be said with regard to the genets. They were not suitable to fight in Europe against heavily armed enemies, and their part could be played more proficiently by stradiots and mounted arquebusiers. However, they were the best response to Moors and Indians. The arquebusiers were called espingarderos in Spanish, and their role grew in the Spanish armies from the beginning of the Italian wars until, for example, the Battle of Pavia in 1525. Slowly, the rodilleros and crossbowmen were replaced by arquebusiers and additional pikemen. For all these reasons, we can understand why the conquistador armies, with their genets, rodilleros and crossbowmen, were so similar to late medieval armies as has been suggested. The confrontation with an enemy so lightly armed as the Native American Indians forced the conquistadors to go back to their traditions. It was not difficult to remember them because the constant conflict with the traditional foe, the Moors, had not allowed them to forget. In Extremadura, Andalusia and South Castile survived a number of units, nobles, retinues and local militias, equipped in a late medieval fashion. And from those lands, most of the men were drawn who first conquered and then colonized the Indies.